at Crossroads. I'm glad you're here with us today. Today is our 46th episode, Friday, February 19th of 2021. Today we've got the COVID Connect news, and then after that, my first guest, David Casimir of Casimir Jones. We're going to be talking about intellectual property, all the way from startups to established businesses, mergers, acquisitions, and more. So we're looking forward to that in just a bit. And then Pitch Party Day 3, we have our third startup, the third and final startup of the month of February, before our judges come next week to reflect on what we've heard and to tip their hand towards one of those three startups for $1,000. And that'll be a lot of fun next week on the show. I want to take you through the COVID news next, though. As we always do, we're going to share the screen and we're going to talk about the COVID metrics, this from covidtracking.com. As we always say, a lot of credit to the folks at The Atlantic who put forward this site early in the pandemic, and it has been a wonderful data source all the way through. The numbers continue to drop, although maybe not quite as quickly as they seemed to be dropping last week. There's a little upward inflection there at the end, but now approaching 60,000 hospitalizations in the US. We always think it's important to have that in context of the total number of hospital beds, which is 924,000 in the US. And so while we were above 120 at the peak, we are now down just nearly to 60,000 hospital beds. Here's the US, and cases falling now in 46 states, staying the same in 4, and rising in 6. And if that adds up to more than 50, that's because the territories have been included in this number the entire time. And that's up from falling in 41 states last time. So good news all around there. Here's Michigan. Numbers just continue to drop, which is wonderful to see. Deaths down, hospitalizations down, daily cases down, as well as tests, as we seem to see all over the world. In terms of vaccine distribution, as you know, it was originally hard to get good numbers. We've sort of settled on the New York Times, who has faithfully been keeping this map updated. This week, they just added a number as to who's had a second shot, but it's been creeping up about 1 or 2% per week. So that little graph going from light green to dark green has gone up about 1 to 2% per week. And the Plains states there, mountain states, obviously leading the way a little bit, West Virginia, Virginia, Maine, Connecticut up there. But it just continues to climb. And how quickly are shots going in arms, also from the New York Times? This line has stayed pretty consistent, maybe flattened off a bit recently, but now we're at 1.62 million average doses per day. That's a lot of doses. And we hear a lot of anecdotes about people being able now to go down to their local pharmacy or down to their local grocery store and get a shot. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, also from the New York Times, I should say, said on Thursday about 41 million people have received at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccine, including about 16.2 million people who've been fully vaccinated. So numbers keep going up. This is interesting because we've always said that older Americans are vulnerable populations and those who have comorbidities. And where are older adults eligible for vaccinations? It's pretty consistent that 60 plus years old is eligible, but only in some counties in some places. And the number actually goes as high as 75 plus. So Oregon and New Mexico stand out there as being places where unless you're 75 years and older, you haven't met the minimum eligibility requirements for a vaccine. That struck me as a little bit interesting. All of this leading up to this announcement, which is on March 12th, we're going to have Dr. Ing Pottinger, the Columbia University virologist that we had on, early in the show, back when it was branded as COVID Connect. And she opened a lot of our eyes to the testing, what had to happen with testing because of her experience with testing populations for HIV. She had developed one of the gold standard HIV tests that's still in use today. And she has been able to shed light for us. She's going to come back on March 12th. Don't miss that show because she's going to help us to unpack what has happened in the roughly year since she was on the show last. That's the news for COVID today. I want to go from there and welcome my first guest who is David Casimir, co-founder of Casimir Jones, an intellectual property firm located in Madison, Wisconsin. But you guys do work all over the place. And in fact, David, the way that you and I met was through some local deals here. And we continue to see each other in the world of university tech transfer. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We are glad to have you as a part of this broader community. I'd love for you to, first of all, just tell us a little bit about the practice so people understand the breadth of things that you work on, and then we'll go into some more details.
Sure. My law firm is a intellectual property law firm. We primarily do patents, but I think that's true of most intellectual property law firms in that most of the work is in the patent space. We also do work on trademarks and copyrights, but patents tend to dominate because that's where a lot of the economics tend to be. We handle most types of technology, but primarily focused on things that you'd put under the broad umbrella of the life sciences. So pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, medical devices, bioinformatics, and everything that sort of touches those points. We help in the prosecution of patents, so working with inventors to draft them, submit them to patent offices around the world to see if they can get patents granted. We get involved in due diligence reviews, helping investors or companies working with investors analyze and evaluate IP. And we do litigation, which occasionally, if things go wrong, there has to be a fight that gets resolved in the courts or sometimes other venues.
I remember when we were chatting before, you said nothing focuses the mind like having your own work litigated. You start to see all of the things that, oh, I'm gonna do that differently next time. But that's, it's wonderful that you guys get to see that breadth. And I think one of the things that our audience will be very interested in is understanding how these things play together. It used to be, people go out and they'd get some money and they'd try to make a life sciences device or product or something, and they'd be focused on, oh, I just need this prototype. And now people are starting to realize, oh no, it's this whole mix of things that has to come together. And I think in the last couple of years, people have been fascinated by what are those acquiring companies looking for. And so a little bit later here, I want to get in with you into having seen both sides of those deals, what matters to those. But let's go all the way back. Let's go all the way back to the startup world. And here we are in startup land. And I think I've got an idea and I've got a prototype and I'm ready to go. And oh, I've got a patent. I must be ready to go. And David stops me and David says, wait, hold on. Tell us a little bit about this fundamental disjoint. It's not just somehow about the patent that I've got. There's some other factors we should be considering here, right?
Absolutely. And so one of the biggest disconnects I see, particularly in startup companies where the management is maybe going through it for the first time. But I would say this sometimes applies to sophisticated CEOs of Fortune 500 companies as well, because a lot of people don't learn about intellectual property. So a lot of this isn't intuitive, but I'd say the biggest disconnect is the concept of freedom to operate, which is basically the concept that says, can I put a product or service on the market in a way that doesn't violate someone else's intellectual property? And I think a very common mistake that people make is they believe that if they've obtained a patent on their own innovation, they necessarily also have freedom to operate. And those are two different concepts. When you get a patent, basically it's a statement that says you have something innovative, you did something that hasn't been done before. But what you did might build on, and almost certainly did build on, the work of others, and that work of others might be patented. Just to give an example, let's say someone comes up with a new IT, healthcare IT feature for a cell phone, and it's got, say, a little sensor that you actually attach to your phone. It detects something in the environment, and then there's software that comes along with it. That's great. It might be patentable, and you get a patent on it. But if you wanted to make your own product from scratch, so in other words, not plug it into an iPhone or something else, but actually make your own cell phone and put that sensor on it and make the software and make it run, you're running into literally thousands of patents of others that relate to the cell phone technology, for example. So you can't make your own cell phone and sell your own cell phone easily. And it's a trap people fall into. They spend a lot of time and money getting ready to launch. Some of them launch not realizing that the product or service they're offering, in fact, violates other people's patents, in some cases, multiple other people's patents.
And so they can't practice it. They think, oh, this is great, I'm going to do it, but something comes along and they need to add a feature, or a feature stands in their way, and they can't get there from here. I think that's a really important point. I know one of the other things that we've encountered, we'll often in our work developing new devices, we will encounter somebody who says, oh, I've got this patent, and we'll look at it from the design standpoint. And I have to say, we're not patent attorneys, and we don't pretend to be them. We don't play them on TV. That's you, David. But we'll look at them and we'll say, we could engineer around this. We could design around this right now. You should go back and look at this again. So from a startup perspective, tell us a little bit about the picket fence mentality for those who are not aware of it. Good patents, bad patents for startups. How should that work in our minds as founders and innovators?
Yeah, it's really a challenging question because in a dream world, what I always think about patents as a patent is a government granted right that gives you essentially a limited monopoly on a concept, right? So it's a sort of amorphous thing, but it sits on top of an innovation. And the types of innovations that qualify for patents are basically solutions to problems. The innovation is you've solved a problem that existed before in some new way. And so the dream patent is a patent that covers all of the available solutions to the particular problem you're trying to solve. Now, the reality is almost no one can ever get that patent. You'd almost have to be the first to sort of try to solve that problem. And then you'd have to do a lot of work to justify getting a patent that covered all the different ways of solving it. So you run into this problem where, um, to get a broad patent that protects your space, the picket fence, you basically need to have done enough work that solved the problem in a number of different ways, in a sufficiently number of different ways, that you can draw your circle of protection as broadly as possible. And ideally cover not just what your product is that's going to launch, but any conceivable product that a competitor might launch as well. And so that's potentially possible. It's constrained by what came before because patents can only cover new things. So if
Mm.
here's the giant circle of all the different ways to solve the problem and people are already living inside that circle, you can't draw a patent around the big circle. You can only draw it in spaces that don't overlap what came before. So the challenge is finding a solution in a space that isn't already occupied, and then doing enough innovative work to grow your circle big enough to justify a patent in that space. And that's very challenging. But it starts with thinking about the problem the way you raised it, which is to say, we don't just need a patent on the product we're making, we need a patent on the solution to the problem we're trying to solve as broadly as possible.
And often getting into those little pigeonholes does not result in a strong patent. It might result in protecting against one vector of attack, but not everything. And I just thought of this, David. So when I worked for my first startup, I ended up getting the first internal patent for that startup, and that was really, really cool. And that startup went on to get, I don't know how many patents. I mean, there's just tons and tons and tons. And I think of all the patents I've got, it probably accounts for half of the patents, or maybe a third of the patents that I have, because the company and the acquirer just kept filing and filing and filing. We've certainly noticed in our work that sometimes it's the second patent that actually has a lot of the value, because you've gone and you've done the work to innovate on top of the basic concept. You've found the tricks, you've found the keys that now really enable the invention so that you can lock people out from practicing it the same way. So maybe, I don't know, the idea of putting a microprocessor and a touch screen on something to solve some problem. Oh man, maybe you got a patent, but it was just so hard to get because you applied it to something. But then when you start to work on it, you get to those details, you're able to then get more coverage. So if you paint this landscape of early patents, first patents, second patents, downstream, big company acquirer, hey, we're going to file everything under the sun. Do you have a sense as to where the most value comes out? Are those earliest patents the most valuable? Are those midstream patents the most valuable? Or are those later ones most valuable? Or can't you say?
It does vary. So I would say if someone is in a space that has not largely been occupied before, where they're
Mm,
doing sort of initial innovation, that first patent tends to be the one that is the broadest and most valuable. But that's probably a more unusual situation. More often you're in a space where a lot of people have been working in the same space and you're finding your own little niche area. In those situations, I think it is the second or third generation patents that matter. And the reason for that is usually the first generation patents are very early stage. They are solving the problem that is defined almost purely scientifically.
Mm.
The second and third generation patents tend to solve a problem that is both scientific and a business problem associated with it. So
Oh,
you're
interesting.
worrying about things like scale up, manufacturability, cost of goods, all these other complex considerations. And it's not unusual when you're designing a product to sort of meet all of the things it needs to meet to be a successful product. You find a bottleneck that everyone's going to have to go through that no one has solved yet. And when you solve that problem, you can potentially get your most valuable patent because you're patenting the entire space in that bottleneck that people didn't even realize was there until you got there. And so while on its face it might look like a narrower patent, everyone's going to have to go through that same pathway, and you might end up with quite a dominant patent.
Let's talk about that for a minute, David, because that's a really interesting point that you had brought up with me before we go to the economics of IP. I think you said to me, recognizing the diversity of what can be patented is often overlooked. Give us some non-specific examples of what that looks like. Maybe I've got the idea for the product, but maybe it's not the product that I'm ending up to patent. Give us some de-identified case studies there.
Yeah, so I will do exactly that, a de-identified case study. So I do a lot of patenting in the medical diagnostic space. And a lot of people's original innovations are around a particular instrument or around a particular set of reagents that is sort of what you call the core assay of the technology.
Hmm.
When you go to take that to market, you realize that there's a complex business chain to get that technology to work that involves so many different problems to be solved. So how is the sample collected? Is it shipped to a different region to be tested? In many cases, the answer is yes. How long is it going to be shipped? Is it going to be stable? What kind of pressures and temperatures is it going to go through? Is it going to be on an airplane? How stable does it have to be? When you get it on site, how do you prepare the sample? When you collect the data, how do you analyze it? And then how is that data ultimately used in a clinical setting? And at every one of those stages, there very likely could be problems to be solved and patents to be had. And some of those patents may be the most important ones, especially, for example, getting a sample shipped, something a lot of people don't think about until they're doing product development, and it becomes a big issue for some types of technologies.
Whoops, I needed minus 80C to get this thing across the country. How are we going to do that? Yes. And that often then results in other innovations like ways to stabilize a sample before you find yourself having to do that. So you ended up engineering around. And it strikes me that that tends to increase the novelty and non-obviousness of the innovation at that point because you've done something that no one else has done.
Yeah, and in fact, you'll see, and I've definitely done these types of filings myself for some of my clients, what we call essentially a soup to nuts patent, which is when you figure out your whole business flow, you may have an innovation that is a combination of those steps to get you from, say, sample collection to final result, where each individual piece might be a known piece, but you've combined them in some novel way that gets you whatever the solution is, a higher sensitivity and specificity than anyone achieved before.
Well, the main message here for everybody is don't assume that it's just the product that you're trying to put to the market that is solely what you're going to be patenting. There's a lot of stuff around that and the delivery of it, the development of it, the manufacture of that really matter. Well, another thing that people often wrestle with in a startup context is the economics of IP. I need a patent. How much does that cost? Oh, $2,000 for a provisional patent, and the misinformation goes from there. Walk us through this process. What should we expect from not only initial filings, but also international, and then also enforcement? Because that's something people don't think about is this enforcement question.
Yeah, and let's just quickly start with how important the enforcement question is. If
Mm.
someone is planning on putting product on the market and running their company not with the goal of an acquisition exit, but basically getting product out there and potentially having competitors and needing to enforce the patents. A patent at the end of the day, I mentioned, is a government grant. It's a government right. That right is the right to exclude others from making, using, selling, or importing whatever the innovation was. So it's a right that exists only to exclude others. And how do you exclude others? There's no patent police in the United States. It's not a criminal action to violate a patent. It's a lawsuit in the civil courts. So ultimately, what a patent is it's a government right that lets you sue someone in court. So if you're not able to do that, the patent has potentially significantly less value. But let's step it back and talk about the costs. So the cost to get a patent vary significantly. There's things you can do to make it more efficient or less efficient, but a good average number is maybe $5,000 to $10,000 on the very, very low end, up to $50,000 to $100,000 on the higher end for an individual patent in one country. There are published sort of averages and statistics out there. They're hard to follow though, because different technology areas sort of have different costs. But a good rule of thumb is expect to spend at least $20,000 to get an idea from idea stage to an issued patent, one issued patent. When you look at really valuable technologies, typically there may be 10, 20 issued patents that cover it. So those numbers multiply up. Internationally, it gets really expensive. A good rule of thumb is expect to spend somewhere between $25,000 and $100,000 per country over the life cycle of a patent, getting it filed, getting it issued, and paying the ongoing cost to keep it alive. So if you're looking at filing in, say, 10 or 12 major markets, it's, you're looking at $1 million potentially on the high end.
And that's something that companies don't always think about up front. And then they're surprised when those numbers start to rack up.
Yeah, and it's something I think even larger sophisticated companies need to be careful of, because even if they have a budget that allows them to pay for those things, a lot of these patents accumulate over time, especially internationally, where they might not have value anymore, and you're paying these ongoing maintenance costs, and it can be a non-trivial part of your annual intellectual property budget, where if you're thoughtful about it, you might be able to trim that and spend that money wisely elsewhere.
How do you be as efficient as you can? And let's start from sort of the startup perspective. What do you advise people to do or not do that they might otherwise be able to do, but to conserve cash? Like, where can you conserve cash and where can't you?
Yeah, I mean, it is really challenging because generally speaking, every dollar is so precious for a startup,
Hmm.
and you almost never have enough money to spend on intellectual property to the extent you could to get maximum return on investment.
Mm.
So basically, every dollar you can spend on it needs to be spent as efficiently as possible. And I think ways to do that, if you can train someone in-house to assist patent counsel to do the work. It doesn't have to be someone with a legal background at all. It just needs to be a scientist who's curious about the topic. I've seen startups salvage more than 50% of their budget, what would have been IP budget, by having a lot of the work done in-house by someone who gets trained by their patent attorney to do a lot of that work. Being selective on which counsel you use. A lot of people like to, especially CEOs who've come from larger companies, like to say, let's hire the most expensive firm. It's going to scare people away. The most expensive firm can be 2 or 3 times as expensive as a less expensive firm, and you may or may not be getting higher quality. Maybe on average you do, but there's a certain threshold you need to get by to be good enough, and you can certainly get there without the highest costs.
Not paying for all the gold trim on the doors at that point. We often will advise startups that in our perception as developers, we think that there is a built-in, almost like a perverse incentive for a patent attorney that's not paying attention and not doing the best thing for their client. And that is that throwing in limitations where the attorney knows that they can get it through, but that those limitations will remove all the value that the startup would have benefited from. How can people figure out up front whether or not that kind of a thing is happening if they're talking to a patent agency?
Yeah, it's tricky because I mean, I think people get advice on how to talk to their doctor, right, to make sure that you're getting the care you need, and a lot of that involves being very open about sort of what's going on with you and asking lots of questions. And I think that same advice applies to attorneys as well, and certainly patent attorneys, which is to be really clear up front what the health that you're looking for is in that patent. What is the problem that patent is supposed to solve? What does your business look like? Because I think a lot of this happens not by attorneys intentionally doing anything deceptive or wrong. It's a lack of information flow. They don't understand the patent needs of the entity they're working for, and that needs to be an ongoing conversation where everyone's getting reminded, and it evolves, and making sure that as it evolves, everyone's aware of that, and then just asking lots of questions, and always asking that question, right? Uh, every time you meet with the attorney, you say, well, remember, here's what we're trying to do competitively. Does this decision get us there? And just open up that conversation. I mean, if there are some attorneys who are bad players, there's nothing you're going to be able to do about that other than maybe spot that and find someone else. But the vast majority of attorneys, it's by either sloppiness or lack of information where that problem arises.
I guess if I come to you, David, and I say, the most important thing here is that we get a patent, and I just keep beating you over the head with that, at some point you're going to go, okay, I'll get you a patent. But it's that dialogue of saying, okay, what are our actual business goals here? And is this patent that we're crafting together, does this meet it? I love that perspective. It's once again, it's the sharing of information with your partners and with the players in your space. That's great. Well, you don't just work on startups, David. You do big companies and everything in between. Take us to the big company world because it's very different. We're not necessarily hurting for money at that point, but getting wide coverage and strategic coverage is important. What are the biggest things on the big players in the life sciences world? What's on their mind?
Yeah, I mean, and so the economics are still on their mind, at least from the perspective of enforcement. And let me throw those numbers out there because it'll put it into context where you can see why it would matter to basically a company of any size. This is a shocking number for most people to hear, but the average cost of filing a lawsuit and then taking it through to trial in the life sciences tends, in my experience, to be in the $3 to $10 million range, which is each side is paying that. That's attorneys, experts, just all of the other costs of that process. So it's a major investment, and it can be much more than that for contentious cases. So I don't care how big a company is, they're not casual about throwing $10 million around. And so uh, figuring out, so startup companies are generally collecting IP to where its primary value is an asset that investors will look at or a future acquirer will look at, give a significant value and put money in or let the acquisition go through. Big companies, generally that's not their perspective. Their perspective is how good are these assets at blocking competition if we need to assert these in court? And how scary of a portfolio can we make to canvas not just what we're doing, but the area around us where it'll keep people away from our business or where we'll have some ability to generate some additional revenue through out licensing. So there are different perspectives and they're not inconsistent. A good patent is going to help you in both spots, but the type of patent you get is going to be different if you're trying to please the investment community versus trying to get patents that are going to be strongly enforceable in court.
That's really interesting. And I think that number is a good one to throw out there because that applies not just to the big companies for whom most of them $10 million, yes, still registers, but for the small companies where their raise might be $3 million. Give me a scenario in which they could find themselves on the end of that stick.
Yeah, and most commonly could because if you're the patent holder, you get to choose, generally speaking, if you sue someone or not. So you have a lot of control on those costs in terms of keeping away your own competition. What you don't have control over is someone else suing you. And so it comes back to that freedom to operate question. If you do not have freedom to operate, or at least someone perceives you do not, you can get sued. And then you're in the situation where you're going to have to expend those funds that you don't have. And I just highlight that as how critical it is to get the freedom to operate question correct, or if there's some challenges there to how to navigate that to minimize that risk of getting sued, because it could be a company ending event. It's hard to go out to the investment community and say, I want to raise another 3 million for the purposes of defending this lawsuit that I might lose. I'm not aware of any investors particularly interested in that.
That's not what we want to sign up for at that point. That's a great one. Not great when it happens. Well, David, let's go over to the world of MedTech specifically. So you have brought a point out to me, which is it's not all the same. The value of a patent isn't all the same, or what I need to get for that patent isn't all the same in all industries. But regulatory barriers play a role in this. So tell us about this. It's not just how much I protect myself through one means, namely patents. This fits into a bigger picture. Paint that picture for us.
It does, and particularly for the types of products that have regulatory exclusivity.
Mm,
It's an alternative regime that sometimes is good enough without patents to justify investment acquisition, all of the things you would want to sort of show off your exclusivity to achieve. Um, so for example, a pharmaceutical of the right type, getting an FDA approval can get substantial exclusivity through the FDA, at least data exclusivity. They're not going to approve another drug, say for the same indication, for a period of time. Biologics are, I think, the extreme example of that, where you can get 12 years of exclusivity, but orphan drugs qualify for 7 years. New chemical entities can get 5 years. There's these little niche areas that can get you some time. So that is a regime of exclusivity that's very valuable and needs to be thought about in the context of the patent world as well when you're sort of building up your picture of exclusivity, because they can play into each other. And one of the ways I think there's a difference between medtech and other fields is narrower patents can have a lot of value in medtech where they might be less valuable outside of medtech.
mm.
Because at the end of the day, if you have a patent that covers the product you've launched that is an FDA approved product, you prevent generics from entering the market by that patent, even if it's narrow. It just needs to be sufficiently broad to prevent someone from basically using the same composition or using a composition for the same indication. They might be able to design around it. But that design around for them might be $2 billion of expenditure to go through their own separate FDA proceeding to get on the market as a second comer. And that might not make sense. So narrow patent can be very valuable if it is associated with a regulatory process.
So it's really the message here is look for where the exclusivity can be had and don't assume that it all has to come through one means. You've got the intellectual property side, you've got the regulatory side, and you can lock it up in both ways. Not so true for other products out there, I assume. Like, I mean, if I'm inventing a better screwdriver, I probably better really find a patent that's kind of Loctite there, or something that's going to be on my heels in 5 months.
Absolutely right. Unless there's some other government regulation. So it's very uncommon, but sometimes people are able to patent a government standard. Outside of the medtech industry. For example, let's say there's a petroleum refinement federal regulation in place that says a certain level of purity has to be achieved, and someone actually discovered the way to get to that level of purity, and they have a patent on that. They would essentially own the entire space because the government's telling everyone they have to go through that bottleneck. Now, there's some tricks involved in that. It is legal to patent a standard. If you're involved in the standard setting process, you have to give notice to the government agency that you have that patent so they can consider that in setting the standard. But it's perfectly legal to own such a thing by patent, but very rare. For example, I don't know what one would do in the screwdriver area there for owning a standard, but maybe there's something.
The Center for Screwdriver Control of the U.S. federal government is taking notice. So this is an area also though where conflict of interest basically comes in, and the conflict of interest isn't per se a direct monetary; it's the ownership of a patent that would conflict with an entity participating in a standards creation process.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so there have been some notable examples of this. One in the life sciences space is DNA forensics detection technology, where the FBI has this set of standards, the CODIS loci they call them. They're specific markers that are looked at to identify a crime scene sample as a link to a particular individual. Effectively, everyone has to detect those same markers because that's what's in the database. And by a certain extent, it is a standard that courts use to assess the validity of a DNA identification. And there were patents that did cover that process
Interesting.
in those biomarkers.
Interesting. So this is not just a hypothetical example. It can happen. And of course, with increasing standardization in medtech, I mean, I think we see that there is a push internationally to standardize, to create recognized consensus standards, which in our case, the FDA frequently recognizes. And so that's where this would come into that process.
Well, and you could see it with just about anything, right? So let's take the very current technology of antiviral vaccines, right?
Mm,
And we're getting these new generation ones out there, RNA-based vaccines. They're new. We're going to learn a lot about how good they are, and you can see that we'll see some standards set on those probably, and maybe one or two entities might end up owning critical IP that covers those standards, which would effectively mean everyone has to come to them and pay them to get access to, say, the RNA vaccine space for the next 20 years.
mm, gotcha. Okay. I want to go to our audience here really quick because we're beginning to run low on time, and I want to see if anyone has a question, which we will queue up here for David. Feel free to raise your hand or type it into the chat, and we'll go to that in just a second. But speaking of current topics, I want you to tell me just briefly, you said that you guys have been doing a lot on COVID-related patenting. What does that world look like? We've talked a lot here about on the FDA side, emergency use authorizations and all this kind of stuff, but there's a whole patent side to that world too. What kinds of things within disclosure limits are getting worked on?
Yeah, it's everything you can imagine, actually. So lots of diagnostics, lots of therapeutics. Um, it, and I guess what's really interesting about this is COVID sort of broke as a big national attention-grabbing topic in February, March of last year. So we're about a year out from that. Patent applications, when they're filed, remain in secret for about 18 months.
Mm,
So 98% of the things that have been filed on are still unpublished and secret at this point. By summer, these things are going to start rolling out, and people are going to be sort of shocked and amazed at how many creative ideas people had that are showing up in the patent literature. So I'd say keep your eyes open for that starting this summer, where those start to get revealed. But unbelievable numbers of filings have been made in the space with really creative, clever concepts.
interesting. So you heard it here. Look this summer for the wave of when those things come off their 18-month uh, not public aspect. Our friend Ken Spencer has a question here. Is Ken live with us?
Yes. So Casimir, thank you. What an interesting topic. I have so many questions. I don't want to dominate this thing here, but um, your talk about litigation costs and protection and things really struck home, because when I initially joined tech transfer at University of Michigan, there we had a company that had a patent, and it was important to them to get that. But they went out and made a presentation out on the West Coast about what they were doing, and it was actually in the sports performance world. Well, a company came out and totally copied what they had, right? And it was surprising to me when they came back and that the university, for instance, said, "Well, we don't help you there, right? That's your problem now. You're a startup, right?" And fortunately, they were able to, come to outside the court conclusion kind of thing, because there was no way they could afford the cost of these things. So, that is not something that these companies that license things from universities, I think, realize that the university is not going to come in and help support them to defend that thing, even though the university had a you know investment with that company. So we now have a lot of startups that are really thinking about whether it's worth it to even get a patent versus especially in the software side on that. I have a bunch of other questions too, but I just was interested in your comment on that.
Yeah, it is a challenge for startups, and in the original license, it is in theory, negotiated term. Different universities have different approaches. Most of them would prefer not to get involved in litigations, but there are some exceptions. In my backyard here at the University of Wisconsin, an organization called WARF manages the intellectual property for the university, and they're actually quite aggressive at bringing lawsuits and have a pretty good track record of winning those. So a lot of their licensees sort of get that advantage, but that all sort of gets factored into the license terms, of course, as well. But one other option for startups where they need to be offensive about their IP, that's sort of a newer option, is there are investor groups now that have raised multi-$100 million funds where everything they do is invest in lawsuits. And then they take a percent of the spoils of the lawsuit. Now, the violation needs to be big enough that the pool of money makes sense for them as an investor to step in and do that. But where there's a serious infringement, there are options now where you can basically get a partner to help you fund the lawsuit if it looks like it's a strong suit and there's some economics on the backside of it.
Wow. So lawsuit investments.
Yeah. So,
Wowzers.
so interestingly, along those lines, if I can ask another question, Gene, if
That's fine, Ken. Yeah.
So I was on the board of a NASDAQ company in Texas and for 13 years or so. And anyway, they used an Intel processor in some of their developments. And, the patent trolls emerged. And in East Texas, they had that rocket docket kind of thing that I'm sure you're aware of, right? And
Yes.
because we were in East Texas, we got sued, for that stuff. Luckily Intel, came in and we didn't have to pay anything out of this thing. But maybe you could comment on the patent troll issue that's out there too.
Yeah, and so the concept, for those who aren't familiar with the term of a patent troll, is basically someone who's, it's defined a lot of different ways, but I think maybe the most common understanding of it is someone who's sort of using a patent for ill-intentioned purposes, largely to basically extort money out of a settlement because the person or entity they sued can't afford the lawsuit, or because the settlement offer is being offered low enough that it's the right economic decision to pay them off rather than to fight it. There's been a couple changes in the law recently designed specifically to curtail the behaviors of patent trolls, and by all signs they're working. So number one was a change in where lawsuits can get brought. The Eastern District of Texas was famous because plaintiffs, the patent owner, won there at a shockingly high percentage of the time. It was a very plaintiff-friendly district. The rules changed recently where you basically have to sue people where they are. Under the old rules, you could sue people just about anywhere. So everyone was getting pulled into the Eastern District of Texas, even if they essentially had very little contact with Texas. If they were selling product in the area, they could get pulled in. That's not the case anymore. So that's cut down on sort of the venue problem there. The other one is the United States put into place a very robust patent reexamination system fairly recently that allows challengers to put what's a bad patent back in the patent office and have it re-reviewed and to participate in that process. It's like a mini trial where you get to fight that patent in person. That system didn't exist in the US before. It's still expensive, but it's about 1/10 of the cost of a federal lawsuit. So it's a much less expensive option to get rid of the really bad patents that, in particular, a lot of the patent trolls were using.
Great.
Ads.
And Gene, I have one more question, if that's okay.
Okay, it's got to be a fast one because we got to go to the close of this one and on to our pitch party in just a second. But go ahead, Ken.
We do a lot of work in machine learning. And right now, we're not pursuing any patents around any of that work because we feel the disclosure of the patent and the stuff we would have to disclose in the patent really would affect our, secret sauce, if you will, out there. I was interested in your comment on that.
Yeah, I'd say that's a common trend. Most people are keeping the secret sauce trade secret rather than patenting for that exact reason. The one exception I would say is if someone has a machine learning process that they've developed that can be employed over and over and over again. So it's not its application to a particular problem to be solved, but a general way to solve all of the problems differently. Those have been patented and have, I think, can be quite valuable, but that's a patent not on a solution. It's a patent on machine learning itself, ways to carry it out.
Great. Thank you so much, Casimir. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate your questions. So David, before we go, I got to ask you the question that I ask everybody. You've been doing this for a long time. I know at the time that one bio of yours was written, you were involved in more than 1,000 patent applications. Why do you still do it? I mean, burnout is a real thing in the world. Uh, COVID hits. We had Rich Sheridan on here the other day, and he said, the thought retirement went through the words retirement escaped my lips actually at some point during this last year. So one of our questions we always ask folks is, what's the passion that drives you? Why do you still do this?
So at the risk of having everyone quit their jobs and join my field and making it harder for me to compete, I found the secret job that's paradise for the way my brain works, which is I love learning new things. I left research because I was tired of doing the same thing over and over every day and getting sort of deeply into one issue. I love learning diverse things, and I can't fathom a job that would be better at allowing me to get access to absolutely cutting edge knowledge in tremendously diverse fields every day of my life. And I also probably shouldn't say this because now all my clients will stop paying me, but this is something I would do for free as a hobby if it wasn't a job.
That's awesome. David Casimir Jones, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate all the insights today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, folks, it's that time again. It is time for week 3 of our pitch party. We called it a pitch party, not a pitch competition, because the very week before we started this, we had our friend Walt Young on the show. And Walt said that, I hate pitch competitions. And we said, oh boy, okay, here. Okay. But no, tell us about this, Walt. And he told us some really interesting things, which is, we can have an interesting discussion about what we like and what we don't like about a particular pitch. But you can't say that winning a pitch competition is going to make you successful as a company. This is all about exploring ideas, seeing what we like, what we don't like, what's important to communicate and what's not. But we're going to recognize these limitations. We're going to have fun with it because pitching and running a business are not the same thing. When our judges award a winner next week for the month of February, it's more for fun than anything. And we'll say it every week. Don't forget the example of Fred Smith from FedEx, who, while he was at Yale, was told that his concept for FedEx was interesting and well formed, but in order to earn better than a C, the idea must be feasible. Ooh, I bet that professor is still hurting from that. So here's the ground rules. As always, one startup per week, pitch for 10 minutes at the end of the show, which we're just about to do. Every Friday from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. On the last show of the month, that's next week for the month of February, our panel of community judges will discuss the candidates. They'll educate us on what they liked and what they didn't like before selecting a winner for the month. And that winner is going to get a check from Into Being for $1,000. Into Being will not participate in the voting, and judges' decisions are final. And we would like to see each presentation be limited to 10 minutes and have the areas of problem statement, vision, value proposition, team, milestones, business model, competitors, and the ask. So with that, I want to make one more note before we have our competitor come on today. And that is that our friend David Weaver mentioned this a few weeks ago to us. We put it up again today, the last week, February 23rd, the Speed Pitch virtual event happening, Cityside Ventures. Get connected there if you are interested. And with that, I want to welcome Valerie Obenchain of Advanced Interactive Response Systems AIRS on. Valerie, how are you doing today?
I'm good.
It's great to see you. Okay, without further ado, and as soon as you can get your screen up there, we're going to give you 10 minutes and we are going to love hearing from Valerie. Are you ready, Valerie?
I'm ready. Can you see my screen okay?
We can see your screen just fine. We do have a spotlighting issue here. I just want to make sure we get that fixed before we kick you loose. And I think we are good to go. Okay, Valerie, take it away.
Perfect. Well, my experience of a registered respiratory therapist is that I kept seeing the same issues with oxygen therapy over and over, but there were no good solutions out there. So while I searched for the solutions and couldn't find any, I then created some myself. So I didn't start Advanced Interactive Response Systems until after I got word that my first patent was issuing. So it was really nice to hear from David and, the value of that intellectual property. So a lot of people don't realize all the issues that supplemental oxygen users face on a daily basis. COPD is the fourth leading cause of death right here in the United States. So, and with these COPD patients, a lot of times they have frequent readmissions for exacerbations of their COPD and can be quite costly in the healthcare system. There's been a lot of issues with mechanical failures to their oxygen supply and interruptions, which can be potentially even deadly for oxygen users. So there was really a need for, a good type of solution. Right now, with everything that's been going on with COVID, these needs are even more prevalent. So oxygen users right here in the United States are having issues getting access to the oxygen that they need. So I was having a conversation earlier with the COPD Foundation about some of the issues, especially right now. Everybody knows what's going on with Texas and the power outages. There's a severe lack of oxygen tanks out there right now to support these people. Even the local Texas hospital is on verge of running out of oxygen. So it's really important that we do something. It's been a long going need, and there's just really not been the advancement and technology in the oxygen space. So here comes our solution. This is the AIRS oxygen flow monitor. And I've actually got one of our devices right here, as you can see. So this is designed really uniquely. We're the first to monitor both the oxygen user and the oxygen supply. So by doing both really helps to ensure that the patients are receiving the appropriate amount of oxygen. This can also help with weaning of patients' oxygens as well. But we need to monitor our most vulnerable. The people that are currently wearing oxygen that require supplemental oxygen are kind of the most vulnerable. Those are the ones that we really need to keep safe and protected from COVID. And to monitor their SpO2 is really critical right now. So what we do is on the device, it will display the oxygen flow that the patient's receiving, key data such as SpO2 and heart rate. But we can also transmit this key information through built-in Wi-Fi in our device. So this will then transmit the data to our app portal. So you can see kind of a sample of the data that we're gathering. A respiratory therapist like myself can then go to the dashboard, view multiple patients' data at the same time to help prioritize oxygen deliveries and help know how that patient is doing. But it's more than just for the clinicians. I have a grandmother who wears oxygen. So I'd be able to pull up my app on my phone and view my grandmother's oxygen data anytime, day or night. Having a device that really can help protect our oxygen users, this is really designed to help those home users and those ones in long-term care facilities where they don't have a lot of people overseeing them. Eventually, we could like to get our data even integrated into electronic health records. So we really see a huge opportunity for the type of information, and this information is really needed right now. We've partnered with Nanan, who's the leaders in pulse oximetry. So we didn't reinvent pulse oximetry. We've just partnered with the best that make the most accurate and quality sensor that we know of. So Nanan is our OEM partner. We've integrated their sensors into our devices. What really sets Nanan apart is just how well that they're made and that they hold up to when the patients are moving around, and you've maybe seen some reports about people with darker skin pigment. Nanan uses this pure set technology, which really gives a quality data that we need to deal with from the beginning. You can see the long-term care and the home care market are kind of our biggest target markets right now. And that's because, like I was saying, they run with very little people. Sometimes in the home market, the loved one might not have anybody there to help monitor them. So our device can even send information to the oxygen suppliers, such as tank status, to help them prioritize their oxygen deliveries. This is really key because nobody else is doing anything like this. We truly are the first to monitor both the oxygen supply and the user. So that's really what kind of sets us apart. By doing this and with the remote monitoring capabilities, we've actually found a way to be reimbursed for it. So we actually have CPT code reimbursement for our product, which is huge because it's really needed in the medical device to have a decent reimbursement. So we have monthly recurring revenue stream that we can utilize with our oxygen flow monitor. And this is based upon how much time that chronic user is needed the monitoring from the respiratory therapist. So we actually bill for the amount of time. Currently, we have other companies that are utilizing these same CPT codes. They're just monitoring different things. So like blood glucose, blood pressure, and ECG monitoring. But AIRS is the first to monitor oxygen and use these codes in this way. We work with Nixon Law Group too, that helps us to know that we can utilize these codes and that we will be paid for them. This is how we kind of compare to what's currently available nowadays. So we're really quite different from what's out there. We're really kind of comparing apples to oranges. We're the first one that can transmit data. We're the first one to do kind of a complete system monitoring of that user. So that's why we have issued patents. So currently today, we have 3 issued US utility patents right here in the United States. We also have patents that are starting to issue in other countries as well. We have our 4th and 5th patent continuation that have been filed that just hasn't issued yet, so it's in the process. So we really make sure to have good intellectual property. So I really appreciate what David had to say. Our first patent has over 70 claims issued it, our second over 50. So we really see the value of integrating all of our different design ideals into those patents, because we do see multiple kind of integrations for our devices. So we also work with AIRS is classified as a spec developer, so we use third-party contract manufacturing services. So currently we use Rose Medical to have a tubing produced. This is our moisture exchange tubing, which is why we're an FDA registered company, because we've launched this class 1 product, which is the first portable humidification system. It allows us to humidify the oxygen, be bacteria static, and it gets 6 months of humidification. Now we're working with Oxys for manufacturing transfer for our oxygen flow monitor. We're planning Lavelle as a distributor to help us sell our products. So Lavelle is really big into the government. We're trying to sell directly to the VAs because the government pays quickly. So that'd be our next big milestone, is to actually be able to sell to the government and get our devices also included into other catalogs as well. So we've really worked hard to put together a great team of people. I'm Valerie Obenchain. I'm the founder and CEO. A lot of people on our team are also investors as well, like our CFO, Diana. We have REA, who's the VP of operations, and he's the inventor of the first pediatric ventilator. So we have Becky for marketing, and Adam. He did some of our earlier prototyping as well, because he's a great mind and has brought other products to market too. So we have a great advisory team as well. Again, these experts in the field are also some of our advisors. So we really worked hard to get together the right team, and we're looking to connect with others that care about oxygen, some advisors, some but just strategic partnerships. We're really looking to connect with, other people, and we would love, that's our big ask, is just to make some connections and to meet others. Of course, we're still looking for some funding. We've got our round A that's currently open, so to help for the launch of the oxygen flow monitor. So if you're interested as an investor, that would be great too, but we're really looking just to kind of broaden our connections out there. And we appreciate your time. Please check us out on our website, or feel free to give me an email anytime at Valerie@Oxygen Alarms. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. We appreciate your being on here and talking to us about this. I wanted to ask you the same question that I asked David a few minutes ago, and we heard a little bit about it at the beginning. But what's the passion that keeps you driving and doing this?
I'm a respiratory therapist, and I seen the need, and that need is just growing, and it's getting worse. It's disheartening to see that my oxygen users right here in my backyard are having trouble having access to the oxygen that they need to survive. So I had to stand up and say, let me see what I could do to fix this. So that's what we're doing here, and we could use all the help we could get. So thank you.
Valerie, thanks so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Great job.
Thanks.
Tune in next week for the judging of the pitch party. Okay, with that, I want to do one thing late breaking here. Jackie Mejia, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your last name. Jackie, are you there?
Mejia.
Mejia, welcome to the show. You had put something in the chat, and I wanted to do a quick screen share here to let you talk about it. Tell us who you're with and what's happening here in the world of BioGenerator.
Yeah, thank you so much for this last minute invite. I'm Jackie Mejia. I am the director of the G-Beta MedTech program. G-Beta MedTech is an accelerator for early stage startups in the healthcare sector. We work with entrepreneurs, startup founders that are developing medical devices, digital health platforms, or even technologies in the biotech space and diagnostic space and therapeutics. We are actually recruiting right now for our next program, which will take place in April, and applications are due this Sunday. So if any founders out there are interested in this free 7-week accelerator, I encourage you to submit an application. As I said, it's a 7-week program. It's free in that the founders don't have to pay any fees to participate, but also we don't take any equity in the companies. A lot of people ask me, what's the catch? There's no catch. It's a completely free program. During the 7 weeks, we're working with the founders to help them refine their business models, make sure they have a strong business model, make sure they have a strong executive summary and pitch deck, getting them connected to the healthcare innovation space here in the Twin Cities. And also at the end of the program, making sure that they're connected with investors in the healthcare space. So facilitating warm introductions, facilitating one-on-one meetings via Zoom, of course, at the end of the program, and making sure that they're on the right path for fundraising, for expanding, for gaining more traction and really being successful. So if you're interested, feel free to email me at jackie@generator.com. I'll be looking at my email all weekend, but also just feel free to go on our website, gbetamedtech.com/apply, and submit an application. It's only a few questions. It's really not a long application at all. And we encourage everyone to do it.
Jackie, thank you so much. And it looks here like you guys are supported by Boston Scientific, the Mayo Clinic, and the University of Minnesota, as well as others.
Yeah,
So
yes,
that's wonderful.
That's great. That's a good point. Our sponsors, so this is a sponsor-led program, which is the reason why we're able to offer it for free. Our major sponsor has been Boston Scientific since back in 2018 when this started. But most recently, we actually received a grant from BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. And we work really closely with Mayo Clinic, the University of Minnesota, Medical Alley Association, and also University Enterprise Labs, which is an incubator here in the Twin Cities. So our goal is to get you plugged in with all of our sponsors and partners, and make sure that you really start creating a strong network of professionals in the healthcare sector here in the Twin Cities.
Jackie, thank you so much for being with us. And it's good to be connected, and hopefully we can stay in contact and pass things back and forth. We appreciate having you here today.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a great talk. Great to hear that everyone is passionate about what they do, whether a founder like Valerie, or a lawyer that gets paid to do his job, but would also do it for free, which I thought was a funny comment. I think this is something that I would also do for free as well. We're all here just to really help entrepreneurs bring innovative technologies to the healthcare sector. We're here to help.
That's wonderful. Thank you again, Jackie. Appreciate having you here.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We're going to give about another 30 seconds here for anyone else with a question or an announcement like Jackie just did. She just reached out a couple minutes ago and said, hey, everyone should know about this. So we wanted to make some space for that. The question here, actually, Jackie, if you're still with us, I think you're still unmuted. This from Vishal. What do you have for someone who does not have that kind of time commitment? Are there any lesser offerings back on the G-Beta MedTech from Generator? Any lesser commitments, or is that program pretty stock?
So the program is pretty set. It is 7 weeks. It's not full-time 7 weeks. I would say really the hardcore commitment is a 5-hour Zoom commitment per week. That's how I summarize it. The only busy week is the last week of the program where we're putting startups in front of investors. It's a little bit hard to predict the schedule that week, but on a weekly basis during those first 6 weeks of the program, it's typically about 5 hours per week, again, via Zoom, since this is a virtual program.
Wonderful. Thanks again for that. Okay, we'll go to our last call for check-ins. If you have an event happening, if you have something you want the community to know, this is your chance. Put that hand up, and we will hear from any of you who want to check in right now. Barring that, next week, we're going to dedicate most of the show to reviewing the pitches that we heard over the last 3 weeks at the end of each show, and we're going to hear from our currently secret panel of judges that will be joining us next week. So I look forward to that. Look forward to being with you again here on MedTech Crossroads. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.